The first live letter for patch 7.5 is in the rearview mirror, people, and it's time to react to your theories about the future of Final Fantasy XIV and see if maybe, just maybe, the few hints we got from the live letter might be able to recontextualize some things. Strap yourselves in. This is gonna be a good one. Hello, everybody. It's your boy Jmulls, and let's talk Zodiark. First up on the docket today, we have at Saizo Akuma 9605, who says, what if the source and its shards eventually need a new Zodiark and Hydaelyn to maintain stability? Imagine two people stepping into these roles to prevent a massive catastrophe. Gaia and Ryne would be perfect for this, since they are already the oracles of darkness and light. The twist would be that instead of fighting, they work together to stabilize the reflections. With our help and the key, they might even find a way to reunite the worlds without the usual chaos of a rejoining. I think I said Ryne there. It's Ryne. I wouldn't be particularly surprised if this theory has way more legs to stand on than if I had made this video before the live letter. Why do I think we might be even dealing with Zodiark in 7.5? There's a couple of reasons. It is very clear from the live letter and the few scattered images we got, we're going back to the moon. We don't know if we're going to be there for a long time, but we're dealing with the Loperates here. Come on. And also, they weren't particularly subtle about this, right? It's like we're just doing the Xenos pose from the end of the Shadowbringers patches going into Endwalker. We're going back to the moon. Now, if this was all a red herring, that would be kind of funny, not gonna lie to you. But I think the main reason we're gonna go back to the moon is not just to talk to the Loperates, but it's probably to go back to where Zodiark was. They talked about the Great Withering at the end of 7.4. One of the things we've long theorized on this channel with all of you guys' theories is that when we defeated Zodiark back during Endwalker, perhaps it had some longer lasting rippling effect that we're only going to start really dealing with now. And perhaps that is what is actually the Great Withering that Halmaru talked about at the end of 7.4. I mean, it is just a theory. We don't have anything necessarily too substantial to work with. That's also kind of the point of the video. Just see what kind of Hail Marys we can throw out there and see what lands. This is more of a really out there theory as well on my part. I wouldn't be surprised if the new trial Enuo is actually on the moon, or past that, maybe in the exact same spot or like near the same spot where we defeated Zodiark back in Endwalker. Am I saying that just because the background for him is rather dark and like these little like light sources kind of remind me of the moon as well? Yes. Like I said, we're dealing with Hail Marys here, people. We're going deep. Now, when it comes to the characters of Ryne and Gaia, they feel like characters that to me feel like a loaded gun in the pocket. Now, am I making this metaphor mainly because I've been watching a lot of Westerns? Yes. However, hear me out here. Having these characters represent light and darkness. Having other characters like Golbez and Zero already primed. We've had their development. We've had their introductory arcs. They're ready to go. They're just like up to bat waiting for the signal to go to the plate. Same with like Ryne and Gaia. We technically already had their arc. Absolutely. But with the little tease that we had with them way back in the day, where they brought Gaia into the main story, with the story that we had in the Endwalker patches, it really does feel as if they're putting these pieces, these game pieces on the board so that later down the line, we can just like get into the thick of it, not KSI, and deal with everything and not have to be like, okay, we have to like introduce these characters and now these characters. No, we've already done that grunt work. We are ready to just tell a story. And I don't know, I could really see them doing something like the theory from before, where instead of having Hydaelyn and Zodiark in this antagonistic role with one another, we have like Gaia and Ryne in a more harmonious relationship, dealing with all these like cosmic elements, if we want to call them that. I could see that being the overall resolution to the storyline. I imagine the Great Withering is going to affect more than just the Ninth. I've long theorized at this point that we're going to essentially get a new team composed of characters from different shards. Ryne and Gaia fit that bill. They would probably be our representatives of the first. Maybe you could argue it's a little bit too predictable because, you know, we've had people predicting this like with this theory before the story is really even kicked off. I think it could be told very well though. Next up, we have at Kalane, who says Ultima is coming. We don't need to dwell too long on this, but I mean, we have talked about this a little bit before, but I do think, especially with the new information we have with the live letter, it is good to revisit this. I don't know. I just don't really buy Halmarot and Calyx being like the big overarching villains for this new narrative arc. I really don't buy that. And I'm not even sure if I buy like whatever Winter ends up becoming to be the big overarching villains. I think they're going to be a villain, don't get me wrong. I just don't think they're going to be the Meteon of this next new narrative arc. I don't think they're going to be the end boss, the thing that everything leads to. And Ultima is a concept they've had in their back pocket for the longest time at this point, and they've slowly, very slowly, like slower than a glacier, drip fed us with new revelations and new pieces of information about Ultima, and especially with us seemingly revisiting the moon with 7.5, and especially if the Great Withering affects all the different shards as well. I could see them pulling something like an Ultima to be the end fight for that entire cosmic storyline. Maybe the Great Withering is a direct result of Ultima. Maybe having Zodiark and or Hydaelyn there was what was preventing the Great Withering from affecting us because of Ultima, but now that they're no longer here, we're being affected. Maybe you could argue that's a bit too similar to the final days. I think I would agree with you there. I'm not entirely sold on that being the direction they go with this, but what I think it does kind of highlight or represent is that there's multiple different ways to introduce something like Ultima into the equation here. Next up, we have at NNYisme, who says, here's my 8.0 predictions. Let's see if I can go 2-2 after last time. So with the wintering approaching and them talking about the shards and the source rotting, I feel that what we are going to experience is a result of Zodiac's death. The ether and souls are not returning to the star. In fact, they are stagnating it. Another thought is maybe they're going the Final Fantasy VII route, where the souls are lashing out against the lifestream, causing a negative lifestream, turning against the source and its shards. Maybe this will force a rejoining, if only to save the whole instead of losing it all. That aside, rather than some grand expedition of the shards or sailing of the stars, we find ourselves traveling back to Eorzea. They've been updating the zone slowly over 7.0, and what better way to celebrate them doing so than sending us back to them. There's a wealth of areas we've yet seen in the old world, and this could very well be a great start to the expansion leading up to the midway point where we explored new areas. Also, far as the seasons we have going on, we just spent spring break in Terral. Now it's time to back to work in the mainland. I don't know, not a solid thought, but yeah. Well, for the last part, I would say that Dawntrail is supposed to represent summer because they wouldn't shut up about it being the summer vacation. Only thing I'm wondering is, do they count the Dawntrail patches as the autumn/fall, or is 8.0 8.x supposed to be autumn/fall? It's the only thing I'm really not necessarily sold on one way or the other, but kind of as is the case with just like the nature of being here in this present moment where we've been kind of teased about what's going to happen, but we really don't know all that much. There's a lot of different things that can seem very plausible. I think there's another example of something that could easily be the route they go down. I am personally pretty sold on the idea that the death of Zodiark and possibly also Hydaelyn has something to do with what's going to happen next. I think it's an interesting idea to transition us from the Hydaelyn Zodiark arc of A Realm Reborn through Endwalker into whatever the heck we're doing now. The other thing I'm really interested in is the idea of interweaving Final Fantasy VII stuff into the next story, like how Dawntrail incorporated Final Fantasy IX. I am a big fan of Final Fantasy VII. I love Final Fantasy VII. And like, despite the weapons from Shadowbringers, we haven't had all that much Final Fantasy VII stuff in FF14. Like, we've had a Kefka fight of all things, but we haven't had a Sephiroth fight. And with like the third part of Final Fantasy VII Remake series, like releasing what we imagine to be the 30th anniversary window, which would be 2027, the timing does kind of line up. Maybe they don't do it for the main story, but maybe for like an Alliance raid, or maybe for just like the raid series, or who knows. Anything, like I said before, is possible here. But I do think there is a way for them to draw a parallel between the live stream of Final Fantasy VII and also Final Fantasy XIV. XIV. Like, if they want to go down that route, there's a lot of parallels they could weave into the narrative. I don't know if that's what's going to happen necessarily. I do think it's a viable strategy though, because you can do so in such a way to where it's not required to understand Final Fantasy VII, or it doesn't just feel like a plotline ripped from Final Fantasy VII and inserted into Final Fantasy XIV. They've done this before. They've done it in Dawn Trail, where they're able to make a lot of very in-your-face references to a previous Final Fantasy game, but not make it feel as if you need to have played that old Final Fantasy game to understand what's going on in Final Fantasy XIV. They do a great job, in my opinion, of taking elements from those former games and making them their own for Final Fantasy XIV. It's like, you can enjoy Sphene as a character completely and wholly fine without understanding she's a reference to Garnet of Final Fantasy IX. I refuse to call it Dagger. You don't need to know that Otis is kind of based on Steiner from Final Fantasy IX. You don't need to know the story of Steiner for Otis to be a fine and compelling character. Or Zelani with Beatrix. You don't need this. You don't need to know that Alexandria is based on Alexandria from FF9. You don't need this information for the story of Dawn Trail to work. I'm talking about the patches here. But even then, with like 7.0, you don't need Final Fantasy IX. You can do the exact same thing with FF7 going forward. You can draw parallels to Final Fantasy VII. You can borrow story elements from Final Fantasy VII and make the story feel as if there is a connection there, but you don't need to make it a requirement to go play like Ever Crisis to understand this one character or something. I hope to God that's not the direction they go. I still have faith in them that they're not gonna do that. And I know that the remake games aren't everyone's cup of tea when it comes to FF7, but I think there's a lot of interesting visuals and themes that could be explored in a unique way in a Final Fantasy XIV context. And if the Great Withering is going to deal a lot with the livestream, and we're really going to explore that element of the lore and story, there's an obvious connection there to the livestream of Final Fantasy VII. It feels like a slam dunk. As is the case with everything, it will entirely depend on execution, but I do think it could work. Also, I'm just gonna be honest with you. Give me a Sephiroth fight. Let Soken have a crack at that theme song. I need to experience that. Lock in, because we have a long one here. We have at Mr. Leo 6986, who says, I've got 3 theories for the next expansion given what we know from lore, clues, and hints. Let's start with theory 1. We need to save the 9th reflection. Its imbalance of lightning ether can only be fixed by the opposite element, ice, also hinted coming with the withering of the 9th. This means we will be going to another reflection looking for a way to fix it. Knowing that the world of ice had already been a calamity, the 6th calamity, doesn't necessarily mean that another world isn't affected by ice, as shown by lightning, the 12th calamity, and lightning being a major factor in the 9th reflection. So that said, ice is a coming future. I would not be surprised with us dealing with one of the remaining shards and them going through essentially an ice cataclysm. I would not be surprised by that at all, especially like going back to the season theory I keep yapping on about here, where I think this new narrative arc is going to be structured in order of the seasons. Dawn Trail was summer, I think 8.0 or 8.x. They could have it be the Dawn Trail patches is autumn and just 8.0, 8.x is winter itself. That's possible, but I think the winter step is probably when we'll be introduced to that ice thing. Whether that's us going to Blind Frost on Aetheris or us dealing with a shard that is dealing with an ice-based calamity. I think it's also kind of a natural extension of a storyline that they've begun a while back to introduce into the narrative, and that is the concept that we can take ether from one shard and essentially pipeline it to another shard. That seems like something that at some point down the line, because we know how Final Fantasy XIV loves to foreshadow and introduce story elements way early into a narrative and then make use of them way down the line, that feels like something they can easily use outside of just like the 1st and the 13th with like light and darkness. There's the whole like umbral and astral difference as well, but like maybe one of the ways we could come around to possibly rectifying the 9th is by pumping in some type of ether, maybe astral ice or umbral ice, one of the two, into the 9th, and maybe for like a shard overtaken by ice, doing the reverse and pumping the lightning ether from the 9th to that shard. I could see this being like some mechanism we utilize to solve the greater threat we're dealing with. I I don't know if it'll be the only thing we do. I kind of doubt that. I imagine we'll have to fight somebody, but I could see that being one of our ways to fight back against whatever it is that's coming. So let's move on to Theory 2. The clue/hint for New Year's stated sail, sea, wind, water. The obvious answer would be sailing. However, with these hints, it's never that easy. The ethereal sea between worlds is a sea as well in a way. We were just given a key to travel to other reflections, to safeguard. This and the fact that it stated wind and water, a rebirth of sorts, I believe this will tie to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X being the next expansion to get more spotlight. With FF7 Part 3 coming out soon, the chances Square Enix would do a bigger story to relate them and give us outfits and such from those connected stories. Be prepared for us to be sidetracked from saving the ninth to be in another reflection that's more related to wind and water. FF7 and FF10 definitely scream wind and water. Both games are heavily connected. Thus, putting them in a reflection makes sense and allows them to milk two of the most popular games in the series. Joy, which can lead us to something that can help us stop the withering or something, but maybe not save the ninth reflection right away. Side note, some new place in the source, the South Sea Isles being a likely area to expand upon, while also dealing with another reflection. We just talked about Final Fantasy VII early in this video, so I don't want to dwell on that too much right here and reiterate all those points. The Final Fantasy X stuff, though, I could easily see as well, especially with Yoshi P teasing with all those nautical themes in that New Year's message we keep yapping on about. And while personally I don't want Final Fantasy XIV to feel overly reliant on using a bunch of tropes or using a bunch of characters and themes from previous Final Fantasies, and I want them to feel confident enough to do something new and fresh and unique, I do think there is a spectrum here, and it's perfectly fine to take some elements from previous Final Fantasies, just so long as you're able to make them truly your own and not feel overly reliant on the past. When it comes to Final Fantasy X and 7, though, if you incorporate some of those elements into Final Fantasy XIV, I think it could work. I think they did this with like Anima back during Endwalker. That was a really cool dungeon fight, and they made that fight feel wholly unique to Final Fantasy XIV, despite the fact that thing was basically just lifted from Final Fantasy X. But it didn't really feel like that if you didn't have that context. And I think when Final Fantasy XIV incorporates elements from other Final Fantasies in such a way, that is when it's at its best, in my opinion. And there's so many cool things they could do from Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII, right? I mean, people have been asking for Blitzball for the longest time. Who knows? Maybe eventually they'll actually give it to us. The Ethereal Sea one is really interesting to me because that could be like one of the interpretations for it. And especially if we're going to deal with all these different shards, and depending upon how they execute on the Great Withering, you gotta imagine they're going to deal with the Ethereal Sea to some degree at least. Like, you kind of have to. And like, I know we had that one variant dungeon that did take us to the South Sea Isles with the recent lore, particularly for Kryl and the focus on that in the narrative. It really wouldn't surprise me if we go back there at some point in the future again to some degree. I don't know if it'd be like an entire zone in game or if it would just be a couple of dungeons or even maybe just one dungeon or like a raid series, but I do feel as if at some point in the future we're probably going to go back there. It's the same principle as with like Mirror City. It's like we know we're not going there anytime soon because Yoshi P kind of shot that down, but we all kind of know that at some point in the future we're going to go to like Final Fantasy XIV's Australia. Like, that's just like bound to happen at some point. And also, like, now that I'm thinking about it, we had a lot of Final Fantasy VIII stuff with Shadowbringers, particularly with the Eden Raid. We have a lot of Final Fantasy IX stuff now with Dawntrail. I mean, those are the two games right in the middle between Final Fantasy VII and X. So like, maybe they're building up to something with that. It makes a lot of sense. And the third theory deals a lot with like Ryne and Gaia, but we've kind of already covered what I want to say on that topic before in a previous theory. But like, this is honestly one of my favorite periods in time to just theorycraft, because when we get to FanFest in April, we'll have some ideas to where we're gonna go. That's going to inject a whole new like dimension to the excitement when it comes to theory crafting, but like, we'll have some kind of North Star to guide us here. We're just kind of like a fish out of water right now, and like anything's on the table, and there's so many different ways that all feel kind of like equally realistic. It'll be really fun to just look back on all these theories and see if anyone was even close. I feel like quite a few of them might be a little bit closer than we think though, but time will tell. So here's where you come in. Leave a comment down below with your theory for the future of Final Fantasy XIV story. And you gotta get them in quick, because when we get to the next live letter and when we get the FanFest, we're going to have way more information. So I want you to be in that pocket. I want you to be throwing deep. Hail Mary attempts only. Lay it all on the line. Go all in. And I may react to them in a future video. And while you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And speaking of the first live letter for patch 7.5, there was a lot to it. And Beastmaster kind of looking kind of good. Want to find out all that was revealed and my thoughts on it? Check out this video right here. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.